of these innocents. Mr. Speaker, it is time for America to stand in their defense.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Unanimous consent to address the House in 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I stand today to express my horror at the accusations made in the trial of Kermit Gosnell, an abortionist in Pennsylvania. These charges are true, they're horrific, and let me speak from my heart. I'm an OBGYN physician that's delivered almost 5,000 babies. And in my heart of hearts, I cannot imagine what must have gone on in the guise of health care in that abortionist clinic. It's physically nauseating to me to think about what this doctor did. Life is a precious miracle, and the children who've lost their lives in Philadelphia were blessed with this miracle, only to have it so cruelly ripped away from them. Regardless of whether one is pro-life or pro-abortion, we should all agree that these children deserved a chance at life. This country carries a responsibility and duty to protect those who do not have a voice, including the unborn children of America that represent our greatest silent minority. They are the most innocent among us and deserve the protections we afford to all other people in this great country. One of government's most important duties is to protect the most vulnerable among us. I pledge to continue to remember and strive toward this. If found guilty, I expect the full weight of the law to be used to punish the accused. And I simply will finish by saying, as a reminder to all of us, what a precious gift of life our children are. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair lays before the House the following personal requests.
Leaves of absence requested for Mr. Burgess of Texas for today and the balance of the week, and Mr. Sessions of Texas for today and the balance of the week.
Without objection, the requests are granted. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
To address the House and advise an extent under unanimous consent to advise an extent.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand here again today to speak for the underprivileged women and children who suffered under the horrible acts of Dr. Gosnell. And again, I challenge President Obama to lead in this unspeakable case. As a father of 2 little girls, just like President Obama, it's time for the President to finally acknowledge these acts. Mr. President, your silence on this issue is deafening. It's deafening, isn't it? When will you stand up and say that we must protect these women and children and ensure their safety? These acts are reprehensible and require your leadership without delay. And I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise?
To address the House in 1 minute and advise to extend my remarks.
Without objection.
I rise to speak about an entirely different topic today, and my topic pales in comparison to the death of the children at the hands of this awful clinic, so please excuse me for the diversion. But what I rise to speak about today is the sequester and the effects on the Federal Aviation Administration. You see, in my state of South Carolina, our budget is actually less than it was 5 years ago, whereas in the last 5 years the federal budget has risen by 29%. 29%. In a time when hardworking Americans are tightening their belts, where state and local governments are tightening their belts, the federal budget is up 29%. We run record deficit after record deficit. Yet with sequester, we're seeking a 2.4% cut after a 29% rise in the last 5 years. 2.4%. My state has cut its budget with minimal disruption because the governor and the legislature have worked together to do exactly that, minimize disruption. This administration, on the other hand, is making every effort to make this 2.4% cut as painful as they possibly can. Thank you. I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Indiana seek recognition?
By unanimous consent, I ask to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, recognized.
Having served in the City of Indianapolis city government as well as working for the federal government as United States Attorney and serving my citizens, and that's what I thought federal government, city government, and local governments were supposed to do, and state governments. And I've worked at a state higher ed institution, and that's what public institutions are supposed to do. They are supposed to serve, and they're supposed to serve citizens. Many of us travel by air frequently, and we're grateful with the relative ease in which air travel allows us to visit, whether it's distant loved ones or travel to conduct business. Government is vitally important in the service to citizens in air travel. But once again, the Federal Aviation Administration is finding more important to play politics with air travel and air service than to serve the citizens, which is what government is supposed to do. The FAA has decided to implement President Obama's sequester by furloughing employees, like their air traffic controllers, vitally important to the service and safety of our country, and causing delays up to 40% of U.S. flights. If this is the only way, this isn't the only way the FAA could save money. There are many other ways the FAA could save money, and they were provided the flexibility to save that money. But instead, in 2010 alone, the FAA spent $8 million on employee conferences. There are many ways they are not serving us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker and my colleagues. FAA furloughs of air traffic controllers and threats to delay flights represent an absolutely colossal failure of this administration. The FAA, the Obama administration, knew about sequestration. In fact, the FAA knows, and this chart shows, that, in fact, air traffic is down some 27% in the last decade. FAA failed to make reductions where air traffic has actually been reduced. The FAA knows which airports they can reduce their workforce. We've got a report right here that outlines in details where we have more air traffic controllers than we need. The Obama administration is poking Congress and the American people, the flying public, in the eye. There's no reason for this mess. I tell you this, if Ronald Reagan were president, this whole fiasco would have been over Monday morning. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These FAA flight delays have been in effect for less than a week, and already the American people are suffering. FAA's financial mismanagement is now costing Americans time and money, and yet the administration has done nothing to reverse it. At a time when families are traveling to see their kids graduate from college, fly across the country to take care of their elderly parents, and make business trips to help support their families, these delays are inexcusable. That's why House Republicans voted twice to replace President Obama's sequester with reasonable and responsible spending cuts, because we wanted to prevent things like this from happening. So I encourage all of you, when you travel home this week, to talk to people in your hometown airports. Take pictures and engage the people you meet about what they're experiencing, and then tweet those stories using the hashtag #ObamaFlightDelays. And above all, please join me in encouraging the administration to stop playing politics with the American people. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to extend and revise my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this week the Chicago Tribune published an editorial that stated what many of us have known for months. This administration is playing political games by attempting to make the sequestration as painful as possible on Americans, especially traveling Americans. The FAA furloughs announced this week, they're not just wrong, they're irresponsible. The bottom line is the FAA has the flexibility to find money and minimize the impact to the traveling public. Even more concerning is that the FAA has chosen not to implement the furloughs in a way that could protect the most critical air traffic control operations and facilities. They're indiscriminately furloughing everyone in the FAA. Air traffic controllers are being furloughed at the same rate as non-controllers. And furloughs are being applied at the same rate regardless of the airport size. Waterloo in Iowa is not Chicago O'Hare. The FAA needs to manage better, and they need to do it now. There is still time for the administration and the FAA to reverse course on these decisions and start making the right decision instead of trying to simply score political points by playing the political game of chicken.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Missouri seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we have seen these political games played before with the sequestration, and the American people have responded unfavorably every time. This decision to furlough air traffic controllers by the FAA is no different. Staff shortages as a result of these furloughs led to more than 2,250 flight delays in the first 2 days alone, greatly inconveniencing the schedules of many people trying to travel across our country. These delays are all unnecessary. There are $2.7 billion in non-personnel operational costs that the House Transportation Committee has identified and which could be examined before furloughs that ultimately hurt the American people. The FAA and this administration have decided to inconvenience the American traveler instead of using its flexibility within the agency to enact these cuts in a responsible manner. When air traffic controllers are being furloughed, yet workers helping implement Obamacare have been unaffected, it becomes clear on where this administration's priorities are. I am very concerned with Democrats using this latest example of a manufactured crisis to cut workers, not waste.
The gentlewoman's time has expired.
I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
People, we live in a representative republic, and so the people expect us at our different levels of government to go to Washington, to go to your local state capitals and get the job done and do it right. We appoint people to get these jobs done for us that you expect, whether the President does the appointments or somehow the House and the Senate approves them. And yet, Washington, D.C. has fallen down on the job. This administration has fallen down on the job on this issue of FAA and air traffic controllers and delays that are going to affect real American people. It's really shameful that we're manipulated in such a way, because what we've seen in recent years, actually since 1996, the budget for FAA has increased 110%. And now in this fiscal crisis this country is seeing, where everybody's having to cut back, whether personally in our own lives or in government, that we're finding ways to try and trim the cost of doing business of government a little bit. A 4% cut in FAA resulting in 40% of our flights being delayed? That's an outrage. It should be an outrage to every individual out there. We're being manipulated this way in a time with a $16+ trillion deficit. We can't get this right.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Missed connections. We're hurting the American public with these delays. We got to do better. I ask the administration to do better.
The gentleman's time has expired. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First, let me just say I'm very pleased to anchor this Congressional Progressive Caucus Special Order on Iraq with my colleague from California, Congresswoman Maxine Waters. Let me also take a moment to thank Congresswoman Waters, who's the founder of the Out of Iraq Caucus. Congresswoman Waters had the vision and the determination to pull together members of the House who really needed some space, who needed to be able to provide legislative strategies, and to beat the drum to end this war in Iraq. The country owes Congresswoman Waters a debt of gratitude, and we thank you very much for that. I also want to acknowledge Congresswoman Lynn Woolsey, who retired from Congress at the end of last year, but who loomed so large during the special order, given her incredible leadership in working to end the war in Iraq and to bring our troops home. She is and remains our sister in arms when it comes to working for global peace and security, for our children, all of our collective work. It was no wonder that many observers called Congresswoman Waters, Woolsey, and myself the Triad, but it was actually Congresswoman Woolsey who coined this term in our formation. We are here today to reflect back on the 10-year anniversary of the start of the unnecessary, immoral, and costly war, to remember and pay tribute to the sacrifices of our troops, those who lost their lives, the injured, their families, and the loved ones, many of whom are still grappling with the scars and the impact of the war. We are also here to reflect on the cost of this war in blood and treasure. On the cost of this war, $800 trillion, 4,486 soldiers, an untold number of Iraqi civilians, countless refugees, but also on the lost opportunity costs of this war to our country. Instead of spending $800 billion on Iraq, we could have created jobs, rebuilt our crumbling infrastructure, or invested in our schools to provide every child with a 21st century education. Sadly, this list goes on and on. And it is especially painful when we understand that this war never should have happened in the first place. It was a war of choice, it was unnecessary, it was immoral, and it was wrong. Over 10 years now, in the run-up to the war, there were those of us in Congress and millions of people in the anti-war movement who fought the launch of this war. We had questions about weapons of mass destruction claims. We pushed for hearings. We called for a full debate, and we called to halt the rush to war. In October 2002, the Bush administration pushed for invading Iraq. During that time, I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I proposed an amendment which the Rules Committee made in order, brought that amendment to the floor, that would have required the United Nations to continue with weapons inspections. At that time, I stated on this House floor, unilateralism is really not the answer. If Iraqi weapons of mass destruction are a problem to the world community, yes, we must confront it, and we must do so through the United Nations, and we must determine whether or not there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. 72 of my colleagues voted in favor of this amendment, which would have led us to the same conclusion that so many soldiers lost their lives and limbs to reach, that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And we all know the tragedy that followed. The Bush administration launched its war of choice, claimed its mission accomplished, and chose to send pallets of shrink-wrapped cash and send more of our brave young men and women to fight on and on, despite the fact that there was no real military solution to the quagmire that the Bush administration created. It's important to remember that this war did not go unchallenged, that there was tremendous groundswell of opposition, and that was critical in demanding its end and helping bring it to a close finally under President Obama. In Congress, this opposition was centered around the Out of Iraq Caucus, which Congresswoman Waters, which I mentioned earlier, founded, and also Congresswoman Woolsey and myself helped co-found. And this was in 2005. Together, we held ad hoc hearings the Republican congressional leadership refused to hold or participate in. We held press conferences, wrote op-eds, and took the floor to sound the alarm. And here I need to acknowledge, as I know Congresswoman Waters will, because I know this is a very important benchmark to acknowledge, that Congresswoman Woolsey on this point delivered 441 floor speeches over the last decade to call for the war's end. 441 speeches. We worked with our grassroots allies like Move On, Win Without War, Progressive Democrats of America, the Friends Committee on National Legislation, United for Peace and Justice, Peace Action, great leaders like Tom Hayden, and others to help build the movement to bring our troops home. And I recall vividly when we marched here in Washington, D.C., past the White House with the hundreds of thousands of protesters in opposition to the war. These marches and rallies and actions happen all across this country, and of course I have to say in Northern California, and especially in the East Bay and in San Francisco, the entire Bay Area of California, we're really at the forefront of this effort. And of course we worked the legislative process as hard as we possibly could. There were many members of the Out of Iraq Caucus who led important legislative efforts to end the war. I recall clearly the efforts of Congresswoman Woolsey, who offered the very first sense of Congress resolution calling for an end to the war and to bring our troops home. From what I remember, she received approximately 132, 133 votes for that resolution. But that was another defining moment. There was a resolution that I offered very early on to repeal the doctrine of preemption. That's preemptive war. In other words, let's start a war to prevent a future war that the President claimed in waging the war in Iraq. There was the McGovern Amendment led by Congressman McGovern, who led on the effort to bring a responsible end to the war by calling for a timetable. And of course, my annual Lee Amendment to limit the funding for the safe, timely, and orderly withdrawal of our troops. What this Lee Amendment was trying to accomplish was to stop the funding and end combat operations, but protect our troops and contractors and bring them home. And one of my amendments, the Lee Amendment, eventually was signed into law, and this was to prohibit permanent bases in Iraq. Now that is and continues to be the law of the land. And there were so many other efforts led by members of the Out of Iraq Caucus, from amendments to resolutions to letters and to floor actions. I want to stop now and yield to my colleague from California and yield as much time as she may consume, and just once again thank her for her tremendous leadership in case she has to leave early before this hour ends.
I'd like to take a moment to express my sincere gratitude and appreciation for Congresswoman Barbara Lee. I want to thank her for having the vision to organize today's activities and to say to me and our other friend Lynn Woolsey, let us not let this moment pass without reminding this country that it was 10 years ago that we were involved in the invasion of Iraq, and let's talk about the consequences of that, and let us do everything that we can to continue to be a voice for peace. I want to thank you, Barbara Lee, not only for today, but I'm reminded of the courageous action that you took when you warned us when there was legislation authorizing the use of military force, that we should have all been against it. However, you were the lone vote in the House of Representatives who voted against that authorization. So I thank you for your work, for your guidance, and for your leadership. You're absolutely correct. In June of 2005, I became the chair and a founding member of the Out of Iraq Congressional Caucus, along with you, Representative Barbara Lee, and of course, our friend, Representative Lynn Woolsey. As a matter of fact, we became known as the Triad. And I want you to know that a combination of actions that we took helped to galvanize this Congress and increased attention on this very issue. And I'll never forget the over 441 speeches that were made on the floor by our friend Congresswoman Woolsey. And she's not here today because she's retired. But we will always remember the care and concern that she gave to this issue. On March 19, 2003, the brave men and women of our armed forces were ordered into service in Iraq. In the following years, nearly 4,500 of those service members would not return home to the United States, and tens of thousands would come back wounded, injured, and their lives changed forever. I voted against the war authorization in the first place, and in hindsight, I know there are many members who also wish they had voted against it. It was in that spirit that the Out of Iraq Caucus was established to bring to the House of Representatives an ongoing debate about the war in Iraq and to urge the return of U.S. service members to their families as soon as possible. The Out of Iraq Caucus provided a real voice in Congress for the individuals and groups who supported these efforts. We had a membership of nearly 80 representatives from diverse constituencies. As a caucus, we kept in close communication with congressional leadership, committee chairmen, to drive Congress toward our objective of ending the war in Iraq. We also worked with other congressional caucuses and national organizations to hold hearings, press conferences, and town hall meetings to educate the American people and pressure the Bush administration to conclude the war in Iraq. At the time, our most important legislative goal was to end the Iraq war and bring our troops home to their families. Our work helped define the national debate on how this could be accomplished. We again organized community rallies against the war. We marched in parades. We held press conferences. We worked with the mothers of many of our young men and women who were in the war, who were serving in the war. And we worked with many of the veterans organizations. I, too, offered a series of legislation to buttress our position that our troops must be safely and speedily redeployed from Iraq, and that we must work to restore peace in Iraq. I introduced bills such as H.R. 3134, Responsible Security in Iraq Act, H.R. 5488, Iraq Displacement Coordinator, H.R. 7215, Human Costs in Iraq Act, Res. 1326, Honor Iraq Sovereignty, and of course Res. 1519, Press Freedom in Iraq. On the one-year anniversary of the founding of the Out of Iraq Caucus, I launched a campaign to inform the public about H.J. Res. 73. Ms. Lee, you will remember John Murtha, the former member of this House, who's now deceased, who introduced H.J. Res. 73, now known as the Murtha Plan, which established a reasonable timetable for the redeployment of our troops from Iraq. We all worked with him on that legislation, and we honor him even today for his wisdom and his foresight. I want to just do one thing before I have to leave, and that is read a letter to President Bush that we all sent, funding only for redeployment of troops. If you recall, by the following year in 2007, we as a caucus delivered a letter to President Bush signed by 92 members of Congress, which stated our intent to only support war funding for the safe and orderly redeployment of our U.S. troops from Iraq. In the letter, we cited the tremendous human and financial costs of the President's failed Iraq policy. And because of you, Barbara Lee, I'd like to share this letter, because you were in the leadership of this. It said, "Dear Mr. President, we're writing to inform you that we will only support appropriation additional funds for U.S. military operations in Iraq during fiscal year 2008 and beyond for the protection and safe redeployment of all our troops out of Iraq before you leave office. More than 3,600 of our brave soldiers have died in Iraq. More than 26,000 have seriously been wounded. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis have been killed or injured in the hostilities, and more than 4 million have been displaced from their homes. Furthermore, this conflict has degenerated into a sectarian civil war, and U.S. taxpayers have paid more than $500 billion, despite assurances that you, your key advisors, gave our nation at the time you ordered the invasion in March 2003, that this military intervention would cost far less and be paid for from Iraq oil revenues. Remember that? We agree with a clear and growing majority of the American people who are opposed to continued open-ended U.S. military operations in Iraq, and we believe it is unwise and unacceptable for you to continue to unilaterally impose these staggering costs and the soaring debt on Americans currently and for generations to come. Sincerely, and signed by all 93 members at that time. Our efforts gained momentum, and by late 2008, when President Bush signed the Status of Forces Agreement, which mandated that the U.S. shall completely withdraw from Iraq no later than December 31, 2011, and all U.S. combat forces shall withdraw from Iraq cities before June 30, 2009. As a caucus, we continue to hold hearings and briefings, as well as speaking on this very floor, until President Obama, who initially opposed the war, approved an 18-month redeployment plan that would begin in September of 2009 and end in December of 2011. Ms. Lee, I'm sorry that I'm going to have to leave the floor because I have a meeting scheduled of the members of our caucus of the Financial Services Committee. But I'd like to say before I leave, again, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for having always been identified as a woman of peace, a woman who understood and believed and worked for peace, and who have always believed that whatever our differences are in the world, that we must find ways to have the kind of diplomacy that can resolve these differences. Some people think that this is not possible, but I know that those of us who believe this will continue to fight and to work for peace on earth and goodwill toward all men and women. I yield back my time.
Well, Congresswoman Waters, thank you so much for that very eloquent and profound statement and for your kind remarks. But let me just say to you also, you have been a woman who has always believed that peace is possible and peace is patriotic. And so I just want to thank you for your leadership, for being here with us, and just say how proud we are that you're our Financial Services ranking member also. Thank you. Let me take a moment now to yield to the gentleman from California, Congressman Mark Takano, who has been way out there in terms of opposing this war from day one. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you. I want to thank the gentle lady from California for yielding me some time. I'm going to switch subjects a little. I want to rise today to express my support for the immigration proposal released last week by the bipartisan group of senators called the Gang of Eight. While this bill is not perfect, I have serious doubts about several provisions in it, it shows that both sides of the aisle can work together on issues facing our nation, that Democrats and Republicans can work together. I am pleased that the proposal provides a pathway to citizenship, a fast track for dreamers, an increase in the number of high-skilled worker visas, and an opportunity for immigrants who have been deported on non-criminal grounds to apply for readmittance if they have a spouse or children in the United States. I do, however, have some concerns regarding the legislation, including the fact that it fails to address binational LGBT families. More than a dozen countries allow same-sex partner sponsoring, including Australia, Brazil, Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Israel, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and many more. The United States should be no different. Keeping these loving families apart is wrong, and it's bad for the economy. Take the story of Southern California residents Brian and Michael. They met in 2005, became engaged next year in Paris, and were married during the brief window during which same-sex marriage was legal in California. Brian, who's been an educator for over 20 years, teaches humanities courses at a magnet school during the day and at Los Angeles Community College at night. His husband, Michael, came to the United States from Malaysia on a student visa in 2005, and since then has been the perfect example of the kind of immigrant we want to keep here. He has earned a master's degree in nursing and is currently working on a doctorate in the same field. Michael and Brian have shared their lives for almost 10 years and cannot even travel internationally to see Michael's family because of the visa restrictions placed on them. What's going to happen to Michael when he completes his education? Are we really going to break up this family? Are we really going to send a well-trained medical professional back? The debate on reforming our immigration system is not over. I plan on working with members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, from both houses, to ensure that binational LGBT families are given the same opportunities as everyone else. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. And let me go back now to the 10th anniversary of this unfortunate war, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to introduce now into the record tonight a timeline of some of what we have talked about tonight, because they should be remembered, and because these efforts and the efforts of the movement that ended this war finally did make a difference. Though obviously not as quickly as we wanted, we did make a difference together. After years of speaking out, and as the toll of the Iraq War stretched the patience of the American people, public opinion started turning. People began asking, what were we doing in Iraq? Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, as the Bush administration told us. Iraq had not been involved in the 9/11 attacks, as suggested by the Bush administration. Then Secretary of State Colin Powell made a presentation at the United Nations that was greatly misleading, stating that Iraq possessed extremely dangerous weapons of mass destruction. Some of you may remember the smoking cloud that he talked about. It was just really very, very tragic. He described biological weapons factories on wheels and estimated that Iraq had, I believe it was between 100 and 150 tons, 100 to, no, I believe it may have been 500 tons of chemical weapons stockpiled. All those claims about weapons of mass destruction turned out to be false. Secretary of State Powell's own Chief of Staff, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, later said about his own participation in the deception at the United Nations, he said, I participated in a hoax on the American people, the international community, and the United Nations Security Council. Iraq did not present a clear and present danger to the United States. Secretary Powell and his staff, they knew this. President Bush, they knew this. Vice President Cheney, they knew this. But they wanted their war. And they deceived the United Nations and scared the American public to justify their war of choice. I distinctly remember the day in May 2003, 10 years ago, next week, when President Bush stood on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln and proclaimed, "Mission accomplished." Of course, the mission was far from accomplished. The war was to drag on for another 8 years. Now, President Obama committed to ending the war during his campaign, and he, of course, did as president. While the war in Iraq is over, its legacy continues, and the lessons still have yet to be learned. We need to look closely at the decisions made, understand the mistakes and misjudgments, and ensure that we never again repeat such a tragedy. I remember in Ghana, there's in the Akan language of Ghana, there's a mythical bird. It's a symbol. It's called Sankofa. It's a bird flying forward, looking back. And the message is that in order to not make the same mistakes as we move forward, we have to look back. We have to know our history. We have to know where we came from, what we have done, in order to move forward, and we should learn from those mistakes. Sankofa. The Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction issued its final report to Congress just last month, detailing billions and billions of dollars lost to waste, fraud, and abuse. The occupation of Iraq was characterized by poor planning by the Bush administration, who ignored State Department and USAID analysis envisioning protracted U.S. involvement in Iraq, requiring substantial spending for many years. The Pentagon was left in charge of managing post-war Iraq, And Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld famously underestimated the resources needed to stabilize the country. When Lieutenant General Jay Gardner told Secretary Rumsfeld that the United States might need to spend billions of dollars to rebuild Iraq, Rumsfeld responded, quote, "If you think we're going to spend $1 billion of our money over there, you are sadly mistaken." Well, of course, it was Mr. Rumsfeld who was sadly mistaken, and the American public who was sadly misled, and the Iraqi people who sadly suffered from the chaos and destruction unleashed by ideologues who used Iraq as a laboratory for a light footprint war. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, those lost opportunities and tragic mistakes are not behind us. I'd like to take a moment now and yield to my friend and colleague, a woman who has consistently been against the war and has stood for peace all of her life, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. I'd like to yield her as much time as she may consume.
Let me thank the gentlelady from California, and I particularly thank you for your astuteness on bringing us together. If I might reflect on memory lane, that was very painful. We traveled a lot together, and I think of the moments in history on the Iraq War. The rising up of the American people was powerful. From San Francisco to places in between, to the 250,000 people that walked down 53rd, 57th Street in New York on a cold morning, I believe, in January. People all over America recognized that it was not these brave men and women that you see here. And I brought pictures of wonderful families and men and women who were called to serve, who we continue to honor and appreciate. I thought it was important to acknowledge that our soldiers have families. We see it all the time. My district is near Ellington Field, and it is increasingly becoming a base utilizing the talents of young Americans who are willing to volunteer. So I take this 10th anniversary as well to pay tribute to them and those who still serve in foreign fields around the world. We know that they still serve in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we come here today on the 10th anniversary simply to ask the question why. And that when we ask the question why, it is not a selfish question on behalf of members of Congress. It is a question on behalf of those brave men and women who, no matter who calls them as Commander-in-Chief and for what cause, they accept the cause. For that reason, it is imperative that we understand the battle that we send them in. In the Iraq War, they allege that there were weapons of mass destruction. We have come to a fairly complete conclusion that there were no such weapons. We all knew Saddam Hussein, and none of us adhered to his despotic and horrible governance. But I will tell you, my colleagues thought the same thing, that our approach should have been different. The bloodshed, not only of the young men and women that you see here, some of their comrades were lost, but the millions, the numbers of Iraqi people who themselves, their lives were lost, and of course, still continue to be in danger. The Iraq War saw more than 4,400 brave men and women of the United States uniform, who wore the United States uniform, to make the ultimate sacrifice, and hundreds, tens upon tens of thousands who in actuality were wounded. Over 32,000 of the men and women that came home suffered wounds, but as we note, those numbers have risen. 500 and more were in the state of Texas. Some 3,000 of the wounded called Texas their home. 500 lost their lives. We know the scars that were left on families, children, wives, mothers, and fathers. and we realized that we needed to make a better judgment. As the tragedy unfolded in Boston, one of the emergency physicians or one of the medical professionals said they knew exactly what it was because they had been in Iraq and they understood the sound of the IEDs. How many of our brave men and women encountered these IEDs, these makeshift IEDs that tore through their body and either killed them or completely amputated or caused the amputation of their arms or legs and the disfigurement of their face? We see them now, call them wounded warriors, we call them heroes, and certainly those who followed in Afghanistan. But this 10th year reminds us of have we made the progress that we should. The gentlelady spoke of the monies, $800 billion, that could directly contribute to the nation's deficit, and as well the amount of money that was supposed to be used for restoration. And because there was no infrastructure in Iraq, we made our Army personnel be the little government. We made soldiers be the ones that had to interact with the village leaders and the chiefs and carry monies to them. No, nothing accounted for, just good intentions, following orders. But we cannot account for those dollars. We don't know if they made a difference. We don't know if they helped bring Iraqis home. We don't know if they helped build schools or hospitals. And so I think it is important to note that when we make decisions regarding war, we need to think about soldiers holding their families and loving their families. We need to think about the better way to go. And we need to ask those whose war we fight. Saddam Hussein is gone. The people whose war we fight, the conflict between the Shiites and Sunnis, we need to understand our history as to whether or not a war that would see the loss of all of these brilliant young people, divide families, whether or not we can bring some measure of peace, some comfort, some stability. And I'd venture to say today that we have not. And I say this to the head of Iraq, the leader, Mr. Maliki, for his participation in the ongoing conflict in Iraq, because that is the case. There is no coming together, the Shiites and Sunnis. There is a cluster of a government that hides in the walls, that does not go out and try to bring peace to the people. And I give you one example, Mr. Speaker, that troubles me over and over again. It is the Iranians who left Iran. We know the conflicted issues and alliances were all, if you will, misunderstood, old alliances, friends and enemies. We understand that. But this is supposed to be a peaceful nation now. And there are Iranians who fled the despotic Iran and have become, in essence, enemies of Iran. They started out in Camp Ashraf. They were called rebels and terrorists. They have now been vindicated, and they're not called that anymore. But let me tell you what the present government of Iraq allows. They allow in the camp, that was Camp Ashraf, that is now Camp Liberty, bombs to go in from the Iraqi soldiers. They allow no medical care to come into that particular camp. Just yesterday, the Friends of Iran, American Iranians, were here, and they had 10 people or more, their faces, who had died in that camp because the government of Iraq, the government that we shed blood for, that we asked to be a peaceful nation, is in essence attacking people on their soil who are unarmed, who are not interested in war, who fled because they had been persecuted, and they don't allow them to get access to cars, access to hospitals. And so people died from sicknesses because they could not get care. When we go into battle and send our troops into battle, shouldn't we ask the question of what is the ultimate result? Well, we understand that democracy in its structure that is here in the United States can not only be the structure that fits every community, every nation, every faith. But what I would say to you is that we bring one of those C-130s, big C-130s that many of us have rode on to go into Iraq. And I spent many hours there, nothing comparison, of course, to those who serve. But I'm grateful I had the opportunity to go and serve and see those individuals who served, and to sit down with those from Texas and to break bread with them. When we land one of those C-130s, why don't we know, and shouldn't we know, what our purpose, our goal, what is our ultimate direction that we would like to see? Not the dominance of the United States over this nation that we help, but to be able to know that they too stand for democracy and peace. I want to thank the gentlelady from California for allowing me to share this time with her, and to say it's important to remind us of the 10th anniversary. One, to say thank you for when we land these C-130s and these men and women come out ready for battle, they are wearing our uniform and our flag. But at the same time, we must ask the question, for what? For what results? For what long-range results? For what peace? For we owe that to them. I ask that we consider those in Camp Liberty and we find relief for them. I'm happy to yield back to the gentlelady and thank her very much.
Let me thank the gentlelady from Texas for that very profound statement and presentation. And just let me say to you that as a daughter of a 25-year veteran of the armed forces, I am deeply thankful for your bringing forth the faces of our armed forces, and also talking about the obstacles now that they're facing upon their return. I'm especially concerned with the widespread and often undiagnosed incidences of PTSD and the alarming suicide rates among our soldiers. The back claims, the Veterans Administration losing records, denying claims that are clearly service-related, and I want to acknowledge Congresswoman Jackie Speer and her work in our area and throughout the country to try to address the backlog of claims of our veterans who don't deserve to be treated this way. Since the invasion of Iraq 10 years ago, over 2,000 current and former service members have committed suicide. The lessons from this tragedy cannot be any clearer. It's a lot easier to get into war than to get out of one. It's my hope, Mr. Speaker, that this reckless and short-sighted decision will mark a turning point in American history, and that we will be more careful about war and use all of the tools of American power, as Congresswoman Woolsey so eloquently talked to us about and introduced over and over again, smart security. That should be used in resolving disputes, including diplomacy. Let me ask you, Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have remaining?
The gentlelady has 21 minutes remaining.
Okay. I would like to know if the gentlelady from Texas has anything else to say, otherwise we will close. Let me just use a bit more time and say that there's no military solution in Afghanistan either. So we must absorb that fact and learn again what we learned in Iraq. And we need to bring the war in Afghanistan to an accelerated end. We need to stop throwing good money after bad and poorly conceived and poorly managed reconstruction efforts and bring our troops home now. And we need to repeal the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, which Congresswoman Waters mentioned, which I voted against right after the horrific events of 9/11. This overly broad blank check has underwritten the past decade of perpetual war. I have a resolution, H.R. 198. It's the repeal of the authorization for the use of military force. This will remove one of the underlying legal justifications for targeted drone killings that has been invoked over and over again, this time targeted killings, to justify a wide range of activities, including warrantless surveillance and wiretapping activities, and, yes, a blank check for war anywhere, anytime, for any length of time. I hope those who are listening and who care about this go back and read that resolution of 914. What it said was the President, and I'm paraphrasing now, but it was the President is authorized to use force against any nation, organization, individual deemed connected to terrorism and the 9/11 attacks. Now, this was in 2001. 2001. No end game, no timetable, a blank check, perpetual war until this is repealed. So Congress really needs to reassert its constitutional authority in matters of war. Our founding fathers were very deliberate in placing war-making powers in this body. In a democracy such as ours, we have this system of checks and balances. On 9/14, we did not have a full debate. From what I remember, it may have been an hour, may have been 2 hours. But we did not fully debate that blank check and what that meant by authorizing then-President Bush, now President Obama, and any future president to use force in perpetuity. We can no longer abdicate our constitutional duties, allowing any president to engage in hostilities without debate, without oversight, and without accountability. And I want to commend Senator Durbin for conducting hearings this week, looking at the constitutionality and the rationale for targeted killings using drones. This was a very important hearing. I was able to sit through some of that hearing, and it was very revealing. Actually, a young man from Yemen who received a State Department scholarship, went to school here, had gone back to Yemen and his village devastated by drones. And so you can see what's happening now, more and more anger and hostilities, unfortunately, toward the United States, unless we get this policy straight about the lethal use of drones and have congressional oversight and debate and really exercise our constitutional responsibility to really declare war if that's what we're going to do. And so as we embark into this new age of modern warfare, we do need rules. We need oversight, we need accountability, and we need to develop an international legal framework on drones. And we understand asymmetrical warfare in the new world in which we live. None of us are none of us have our head in the sand, about that. We just need to make sure that Congress has a role in debating exactly how we're going to, if we're going to, and when the appropriate use of force is necessary. For me personally, I believe in smart security, and I know that that will lead to a world that our children deserve and worthy of our children's future. So let's put this decade of perpetual warfare behind us. We should bring our troops home. We should invest in our veterans and our children, create jobs here at home, and really begin to invest in our future for the sake of our children and our grandchildren. I want to just remind you, and I have this chart here, to show you just in terms of the fiscal implications of what these policies have brought. When you look at the deficit with the war and the economic policies of the Bush era, the tax cuts, we're looking at this line right here. Had these unfortunate policies not occurred, our deficit would be down here. This is very clear. This was put forth by the Congressional Budget Office in February. These are their estimates, and it is very clear, I hope, to everyone that the failed economic policies of the Bush administration, the wars in Iraq, are the major contributing factors to the economic crisis that we find ourselves in. And so aside from the human toll that this 10-year war has taken and the war in Afghanistan has taken, we have a real crisis now, an economic crisis in this country that we need to come to grips with. Our senior citizens did not cause this crisis. Our children did not cause this crisis. The poor, our middle-class individuals and families did not cause this crisis. And we cannot forget what has taken place over the last 10 years of this unbelievably, terribly sad time in our history where we lost so many lives and we lost so much time in terms of rebuilding our country for the future of our children. Thank you, and now I yield the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Hartzler, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, when I was 10 years old, I got my first job. And it would require skill and perseverance and patience, and it would have a real potential economic impact on our family hog farm. My dad hired me, and he paid me 15 cents a unit. What was my job? It was shooting sparrows around our farm. At that time, there was a disease going around rural America, and sparrows were taking it from farm to farm. And so it had a real practical purpose, but as I'm a parent now, I look back on it. I used to tag around with my dad all the time, and I wonder maybe if he just kind of wanted to give me something to do in addition to it. But I had a lot of fun that summer going around the grain bins and the sheds on our farm and our buildings and trying to catch that bird unawares. And I think over the entire summer, I may have earned around 45 cents. So it wasn't a big money maker, but I sure had a lot of fun, and I learned some important things. I learned that using firearms can be a fun hobby and hunting can be fun, and also that using firearms can have a real practical purpose. And over the years, I've shot a lot of different kinds of firearms now in different sizes, but I really appreciate what our founding fathers did when they established our Second Amendment and gave us that as our basic right. You know, this afternoon, my colleagues and I want to highlight not only why the Second Amendment is important to us and to the people in our districts, but how it is also important to this country. We want to dispel the myth that decisions about how to address violence are based on facts and not emotions. You know, as a lifelong gun owner, as well as a former public school teacher, I appreciate the thoughtful discussion that our country's been having after the tragic school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. My heart has gone out to those families, as I know everyone in America's heart has, and our prayers as well. We want to understand, and I understand, the desire to stop the violence. I share that goal, but believe many of the proposals being put forth miss the mark. So let's look at some of the proposals and compare them to the facts. One proposal that is being talked about and has been talked about is to ban what's called assault rifles. Well, the fact is that lawbreakers ignore the laws. Banning firearms would only take guns away from our law-abiding citizens and ensure that lawbreakers have guns. You know, I was watching TV a couple of weeks ago, and I saw the sponsor of the Senate bill to ban these assault rifles, and she was giving a rationale why she thought it was important, and she was saying, well, gangs in California have assault rifles, and we've got to get these off the streets and out of the hands of our gang members, so we need to pass this bill. And I just kind of scratched my head and I thought, do you really believe that gang members are going to listen and pay attention to a law that Washington, D.C. passes? They break laws every day. I really can't see them getting together and having an organizational meeting and saying, well, let's have the legislative report and have the gentleman in the gang member say, well, you know, they passed a new law in D.C., and so I guess we can't use assault rifles anymore. I mean, we've got to look at the facts about whether passing this law would really address violence. In this case, it certainly wouldn't. As far as that legislation, also, the word assault is an adjective. It is not a gun. What gun control advocates call an assault rifle is actually a regular rifle with only a few cosmetic differences on the outside, such as a pistol grip, a hand guard, and a removable magazine. It is misleading to label firearms with negative words in order to advance a gun control agenda. The fact is that more deaths have been inflicted using fists and knives and baseball bats than with a gun. In fact, 1.5 times as many homicides are committed with blunt objects such as a baseball bat, over 2 times as many homicides with fists, and 5 times as many with knives. So why aren't proponents of bans on firearms calling baseball bats assault baseball bats or assault knives? Well, the reason is because the American people know that objects are only tools of people who wish to do others harm. They are not the cause. Now, it's a slogan, it's a bumper sticker, but it is true. Guns don't kill people. People do. So that's one proposal that I think misses the mark. Another proposal is to what's called create universal background checks. Well, the fact is that the vast majority of gun sales already have background checks with the sale because all firearm sales through dealers must complete the instant background check. The only transactions that do not require the background checks are sales between individual gun owners, and they are not the problem. Requiring law-abiding citizens to have to go to a dealer and get a background check on their neighbor in order to sell him a gun would do little to stop mass killings. Imposing the new law would not have stopped the Sandy Hook killer. He stole the guns he used to carry out his evil scheme. Same with the Aurora, Colorado shooter in the movie theater. He actually had passed a background check. So passing a new law like this does not really address the issue. So what is it's time for all of us to address the real issue of how to protect our children in schools rather than to use a tragedy to impose more government control on law-abiding citizens or infringe on our Second Amendment rights. So several of my colleagues are going to join me today to share their insights into why the Second Amendment matters to them and their constituents and to discuss how to address the real issues of violence in our country. So I would like to start off with my fellow colleague from the great state of Missouri. We have Blaine Luetkemeyer. So, gentlemen, what would you like to share about our Second Amendment rights?
Thank you, Congressman Hartzler.